The transport exploded with a force that lifted 8,000 tons of steel partially out of the water. Through the fireball, Chief Petty Officer Tom Harrigan could see hundreds of Japanese soldiers spilling into the Black Ocean, their screams audible even over the roar of PT-164's Packard engines racing away at 40 knots. The ship's back broke with a sound like thunder, splitting her in two, both halves sinking immediately into the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. 20 seconds earlier, they'd been invisible. Now they were executioners. This is how 3 wooden boats, each smaller than a private yacht, sank a Japanese convoy carrying 8,000 enemy soldiers who would have slaughtered American Marines. This is the classified story that changed naval warfare forever. This is how America's secret weapon taught the Japanese Empire to fear darkness. But to understand how plywood speedboats could challenge steel warships at the height of Imperial Japan's power, the story begins 30 seconds before that explosion, when a searchlight swept across the water like the finger of death. The Japanese destroyer's searchlight missed PT-164's bow by less than 3 feet. 23 American sailors stopped breathing, pressed flat against the wooden deck, trying to become invisible in waters that belonged to the enemy. It was 23:56 hours on July 19th, 1943, and in exactly 4 minutes, they would either change the Pacific War or die trying. Harrigan's knuckles ached from gripping the twin .50 caliber mount so tightly that metal left impressions in his palms. Beside him, Ensign Robert Vanderberg, Dutch to everyone who served with him, whispered coordinates so quietly they might have been prayers. The green phosphorescent glow of their compass was the only light they dared show, a tiny beacon of American presence in Japanese-controlled waters. Behind that destroyer, 3 massive transports carried nearly 8,000 enemy soldiers bound for Kolombangara, where American Marines were bleeding to take a strategic airfield. Every Japanese reinforcement meant more telegrams sent to American mothers, more folded flags handed to widows, more boys who would never come home. The destroyer's searchlight continued its sweep, moving past them, hunting for threats that made sense. Submarines, surface ships, things that followed the rules of naval warfare. They weren't looking for 3 plywood boats crewed by volunteers, hidden in the moon shadow cast by Vela Lavella's volcanic peaks. They weren't expecting America's secret weapon. Lieutenant Commander Arthur McPherson, Mac to his crew, kept his hand on the throttles. Engines cut to idle, letting the boat drift on current and momentum. One wrong sound, and those destroyers would light them up like carnival targets. Behind them, in the darkness, PT-168 and PT-171 waited for the signal that would unleash 3 small boats against steel giants. The searchlight finally moved away. Harrigan released his breath slowly, carefully, as if exhaling might carry across 300 yards of water. Dutch checked his watch. 3 minutes and 40 seconds until they'd unleash hell. None of them knew that this night would break the Japanese Navy's spirit. None of them knew that 6 months from now, enemy admirals would be calling PT boats devil craft and changing their entire strategy out of fear. They only knew that if they failed tonight, thousands of Japanese soldiers would reach Kolombangara and kill Americans. But how did 23-year-old sailors in wooden boats end up challenging the most feared navy in the Pacific? The answer begins 6 months earlier, with a disaster that nearly ended the PT boat program before it began. The Americans were losing the night war in the Solomon Islands, and everyone knew it. Every sunset brought terror to Allied sailors stationed in these waters. The Japanese owned darkness so completely that American commanders had standing orders to withdraw all major warships before twilight. Cruisers, destroyers, even aircraft carriers, all fled to safer waters once the sun dipped below the horizon. The defeat at Savo Island had been catastrophic. On August 9, 1942, a Japanese force sank 4 Allied cruisers in less than an hour of savage night combat without losing a single ship. American sailors began calling the waters off Savo Island Iron Bottom Sound for all the ships resting in the deep. After Savo, Japanese confidence in night operations bordered on arrogance. They ran their Tokyo Express with near impunity, fast destroyer squadrons racing down from Rabaul after dark, carrying troops and supplies to embattled garrisons, then racing back before dawn brought American air power. The Americans called them rat runs, but there was nothing cowardly about the operation. It was brilliant, aggressive, and brutally effective. The American Navy needed something different, something the Japanese wouldn't expect, something that could operate in confined waters where big ships couldn't maneuver. The answer was the PT boat, desperation turned into plywood, and high explosives, 80 feet long, powered by 3 aircraft engines armed with torpedoes that cost more than houses. They could hit 45 knots, faster than anything the Japanese could chase them with. But they were wood-fighting steel, and one good hit would turn them into floating splinters. None of the first volunteers knew that in exactly 17 days, one of them would watch PT-158 disintegrate from a direct hit, 12 men blown to fragments in less than a second. But that lesson was coming. Harrigan first saw a PT boat in February 1943 at the training center in Melville, Rhode Island. He'd been a destroyer sailor fresh from convoy duty in the North Atlantic when the Navy asked for volunteers for hazardous duty with experimental vessels. The recruiter wouldn't explain what these vessels were, only that the casualty rate was expected to exceed 50%. Out of 200 volunteers, they selected 40. Harrigan made the cut because he could navigate by stars and had small boat experience from growing up on Chesapeake Bay. Skills he'd thought were useful for a sailor. He didn't know they were survival skills for a ghost. When he first stepped aboard PT-164, he thought the Navy had lost its mind. The hull was plywood, wood in a war of steel and high explosives. The living quarters were so cramped that men slept in shifts. There was no armor except some sheet metal around the bridge. This wasn't a warship. It was a glorified speedboat with delusions of grandeur. Then he met Mac, and everything changed. Mac was 28 years old, with eyes that had already seen the end of the world. He'd been at Pearl Harbor aboard the destroyer USS Shaw when the Japanese attacked, had watched his ship's forward magazine explode in a fireball that became one of the most famous photographs of the war. He'd survived that, survived Midway, and then volunteered for PT boats because, as he explained to his crew, he was tired of being a target. Time to become the hunter. Mac understood something that would take the rest of them weeks to learn. PT boats weren't meant to fight like conventional warships. They were maritime guerrillas, seagoing assassins who struck from ambush and vanished before the enemy could react. The crew was a collection of specialists who'd never have served together on a regular Navy vessel. Dutch Vanderberg was a Yale mathematics professor who could calculate torpedo firing solutions in his head faster than most men could work a slide rule. Chief motor machinist's mate Carlos Mendoza had been building racing engines in Los Angeles before the war and could make their temperamental Packards purr like kittens or roar like lions depending on what they needed. Gunner's mate. First class Patrick O'Brien was an artist with torpedoes. Each Mark 13 weighed 2,200 pounds and cost as much as a house back home. Patty treated them better than most men treated their wives, constantly adjusting, cleaning, and sweet-talking them. "These beauties are the only reason the Japanese will take us seriously," he'd say, while polishing the bronze propellers. "One shot, one kill, or we're just expensive target practice." Training at Melville was brutal and unforgiving. Commander James Patterson, Wild Jim to anyone who'd served under him, had escaped from the Philippines on one of the last PT boats out of Corregidor. He had a simple training philosophy that would define every mission afterward. "The Japanese expect you to fight fair," Patterson told them during one memorable lecture, his uniform still bearing scorch marks from the Philippines campaign. "Don't. They expect you to follow naval tradition. Don't. They expect you to be afraid of the dark. Make them afraid instead." He taught them that their greatest weapons weren't torpedoes, but surprise, speed, and sheer audacity. They practiced high-speed attacks until they could launch torpedoes accurately while bouncing across waves at 40 knots. They learned to navigate by sound and instinct when tropical squalls reduced visibility to zero. Most importantly, they learned to think like pirates rather than sailors. But training couldn't prepare them for everything. Their first combat patrol would teach them that lesson in blood. They arrived at their forward base at Rendova on June 30th, 1943, just as the invasion of New Georgia was beginning. The base was nothing more than a fuel dump, some camouflaged Quonset huts, and a rough dock hidden under palm fronds. The first thing they noticed was the smell, rotting vegetation, diesel fuel, and the sweet stench of tropical decay. The second thing was the sound of artillery fire from New Georgia, where Marines were dying to take Munda Airfield. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9 consisted of 12 PT boats tasked with interdicting Japanese reinforcement attempts in the Central Solomons. The mission sounded simple: patrol the waters between major Japanese bases and sink anything flying the rising sun. The reality was far more complex. These waters were a maze of coral reefs, volcanic islands, and hidden Japanese strongpoints. The enemy had seaplanes for reconnaissance, coast watchers on every major island, and destroyer squadrons specifically trained to hunt PT boats. Their first patrol on July 5th was a disaster that nearly broke them. 3 boats, including PT-164, attempted to intercept a Japanese convoy near Visu. Intelligence had been good, the approach textbook perfect, coordination flawless. But a Japanese float plane spotted them before they could reach the attack position, and suddenly 4 destroyers were bearing down on them with searchlights blazing and guns firing. They scattered like rabbits, racing through a gauntlet of shell splashes. Harrigan remembered that night as a nightmare of near misses and terror, water columns erupting around them, tall enough to drench everyone on deck, the boat twisting and turning through a forest of death. Then PT-158 took a direct hit. One moment she was racing alongside them, her skipper visible on the bridge, her guns firing defiantly at the destroyers. The next moment, a 5-inch shell struck directly amidships, and the boat simply disintegrated. There was no explosion, no fireball, just a sudden absence where a boat and 12 men had been. Splinters and debris scattered across the water. Bodies, what remained of them, tumbled through the air. Harrigan had known some of those men, had played poker with them, had shared cigarettes and stories. Now they were fragments scattered across Iron Bottom Sound, names that would be added to casualty lists, telegrams that would arrive at homes back in America with the phrases "regret to inform," and gave their lives. They spent 4 hours dodging through reefs and islands before finally escaping. No torpedoes fired, no enemy ships were damaged. 1 boat and 12 men lost for nothing. That night, huddled in the primitive base at Rendova, while mechanics worked to repair damage, Mac gathered the surviving crews. He didn't give them a pep talk or try to minimize what had happened. He just stated a truth that would define every mission afterward. "We learned something important today," Mac said quietly. "We can't fight them like destroyers fight each other. We're not built for gun duels. We strike from ambush, or we don't strike at all. Anyone who forgets that will end up like PT-158, Sotaron." It was a hard lesson, purchased with blood, but it shaped everything that followed. Over the next 2 weeks, Squadron 9 developed new tactics through trial and error. They learned to use island radar shadows, blind spots, where mountains blocked Japanese radar coverage. They discovered that shutting down 2 engines and running on one reduced their acoustic signature dramatically, letting them creep closer before launching attacks. Most importantly, they figured out how to coordinate multiple boats using simple light signals that Japanese radio intercept stations couldn't detect. The intelligence network supporting them was remarkable. Australian coast watchers hiding on Japanese-occupied islands would radio enemy ship movements, risking execution if discovered. Native Solomon Islanders, whose knowledge of these waters went back generations, would paddle their canoes out to meet PT boats with information about Japanese positions. The PT boats remained classified as secret weapons through July 1943. Official Navy communications never mentioned them by name, referring only to small craft or mosquito boats. The Japanese knew something was hitting their convoys, but their initial reports described attacks by submarines or mines. Their intelligence officers couldn't believe Americans would send wooden speedboats against steel warships. That disbelief was Squadron 9's greatest advantage. On the night of July 18th, everything they'd learned would be tested against the target they'd been waiting for. The Coast Watcher transmission arrived during evening mess, crackling with static, but clear enough. Major Japanese convoy forming at Buin, estimate 3 transports, minimal escort. Course indicates Kolombangara, ETA your area, 2300 hours tomorrow. Commander William Specht, Squadron 9's leader, called an immediate briefing. Intelligence estimated 3 large transports carrying elements of the Japanese 13th Regiment, elite troops who'd fought in China and the Philippines. 8,000 soldiers total, destined for Kolombangara to reinforce the garrison defending Vila. "Gentlemen," Specht said, his voice carrying the weight of command and consequence. "This convoy cannot reach Vila. I don't care if you have to ram those transports. They go to the bottom tomorrow night." Mack volunteered PT 164 immediately. Bramwell and Antonelli followed, their boats joining the attack force. 3 boats, 12 torpedoes total, 36 men against a convoy that could blow them to matchsticks. But if those 8,000 Japanese soldiers reached Kolombangara, they'd make the Marines pay for every yard of that island in American blood. In 6 hours, Tom Harrigan would fire his machine guns point blank into a Japanese destroyer's bridge while sailing between 2 enemy warships at 40 knots. Right now, he was just checking his weapons for the 5th time, trying not to think about dying. The rest of July 19th passed in preparation that felt like ritual. Every man had his tasks, his way of preparing for what might be his last night alive. Paddy O'Brien ran through his checklist for the 5th time, even though nothing had changed since the 4th. Each Mark 13 torpedo had been inspected, adjusted, and inspected again. Depth setting, 10 feet, optimal for hitting a loaded transport below the waterline. Speed setting, 28 knots. Gyroscope, calibrated and locked. He moved along the tubes, touching each torpedo like the priest blessing congregation members. "Talk to me, beauties," Paddy whispered, his hand resting on the first torpedo's smooth metal skin. "Tonight you get to do what you were born for." Paddy whispered to his torpedoes, promising them Japanese ships. In 4 hours, they'd deliver on that promise, killing 6,000 men who'd never reach shore. Charlie Mendoza performed his own ritual with the engines, 3 Packard V12S, each one a mechanical miracle when they worked, and a mechanical nightmare when they didn't. He sat with one hand on each outboard engine, the center engine between his knees, feeling their warmth, listening to them cool. "All right, you temperamental bastards," Charlie murmured. "Tonight we need perfection. Give me everything you got, and I'll get us home." On the bridge, Dutch Vanderberg bent over the navigation chart, recalculating vectors even though the mathematics hadn't changed. The enemy convoy would enter Blackett Strait around 2300 hours, passing through the narrowest section where Kolombangara and Vella La Vella created a natural choke point. They'd be trapped, no room to maneuver, no space to evade. Perfect ambush terrain if you were the ambusher, perfect death trap if you were the ambushed. The numbers were clean, precise, beautiful in their mathematical certainty. But Dutch knew that combat never respected mathematics. 1,000 variables existed between calculation and execution, and any one of them could mean the difference between triumph and disaster. Harrigan sat at his machine gun mount, running a cleaning patch through each barrel even though he'd cleaned them that morning. The twin .50 caliber Brownings were already immaculate, but he cleaned them again anyway, finding comfort in the ritual. He'd loaded the ammunition belts personally, armor-piercing incendiary alternating with tracer rounds, 600 rounds per gun. At 850 rounds per minute, he had less than 90 seconds of sustained fire before running dry. 90 seconds to make a difference. 90 seconds to suppress enemy gun crews, to punch holes in bridge windows, to make destroyers flinch at the critical moment. Some men wrote letters, carefully addressed envelopes that would be mailed tomorrow if they came back, or sent with personal effects if they didn't. Harrigan had written his weeks ago, a letter to his parents that started, "If you're reading this," and ended with, "I love you and I'm not afraid." He'd lied about the not being afraid part, but some lies were kinder than truth. As evening approached and the sun painted the sky blood red over the Solomon Islands, the reality settled over them like a weight. Tomorrow they'd tell stories about tonight, or they'd be added to the casualty lists. At 20:30 hours precisely, Mac gave the order. Lines were cast off, engines started with muffled roars, and 3 PT boats slipped away from Rendova into the gathering darkness. They moved in column formation, maintaining 50-yard spacing, navigation lights dark, running on instruments and instinct. The ocean was rougher than Harrigan had hoped, 2-foot swells rolling in from the southeast. The chop would make torpedo accuracy challenging, but it would also mask their wakes and make their engine noise harder to pinpoint. Every advantage mattered when you were 80 feet of plywood attacking 400 feet of steel. They tested weapons at 2100 hours. The night erupted briefly in gunfire as 12 machine guns and 3 20mm cannons barked into empty ocean. Tracers arced across the darkness. Then silence again, broken only by engine rumble and wave hiss. Everything worked. For now. By 2300 hours, they'd reached the ambush position off Vella Lavella's northern coast. Mac cut engines to idle, and they drifted, becoming shadows among shadows. The volcanic peaks behind them blocked Japanese radar, making them invisible to electronic detection. Now, they just had to stay invisible to human eyes. The wait was torture. Nothing to do but sit in darkness, listening to the ocean, watching stars wheel overhead, wondering if the intelligence was accurate. Every minute felt like an hour. Harrigan's hands found the machine gun grips again. His palms were sweating despite the night chill. He wiped them dry on his pants, gripped the guns again. Sweat returned immediately. At 23:47 hours, Sparks Patterson's urgent whisper cut through the darkness. Transmission from Coast Watcher. 3 large ships, 2 escorts bearing 280, speed 18 knots, range 15 miles from our position. 15 miles. At the convoy's current speed and their own intercept course, they had roughly 30 minutes before contact. The target was coming. Now came the final approach, the moment when they'd transition from hunters hiding in ambush to attackers racing toward guns that could blow them apart. Mac started 2 engines, keeping throttles low, just enough power to position them correctly. Minutes passed like geological epochs. Harrigan's heart hammered so hard he could feel it pulsing in his fingertips. Then Dutch's voice, barely louder than breathing. Contact, bearing 275, multiple shapes, distance approximately 8,000 yards. Harrigan looked where Dutch indicated and saw them, dark masses against the star field, shadows that moved with mechanical purpose. The Japanese convoy, exactly where it should be, exactly when it should be, heading directly into the killing ground. The formation was textbook. 2 destroyers in the lead, 3 transports following, another destroyer bringing up the rear. They showed no lights, trusting in their superior night vision and practiced coordination, confident that these waters belonged to them. They were about to learn otherwise. But first, a question worth considering. When does necessity justify mass killing? The crew of PT-164 was about to kill thousands of men, fathers, brothers, sons. War demands these choices. History judges them afterward. Right now, in this moment, they had no choice but to act. At 2,000 yards, Harrigan could hear the convoy's engines, deep thrumming of massive diesels pushing thousands of tons through water. At 1,500 yards, details emerged from darkness. The pagoda-style bridge of the lead destroyer, cargo booms on the transports, figures moving on deck, enemy sailors who didn't know death was approaching. At 1,000 yards, Mac's hand moved to the radio switch. His fingers paused for one final moment, the last second of stillness before chaos, the last breath before plunging into violence that couldn't be taken back. Then he pressed the switch 3 times. click, click, click. 3 boats exploded into motion simultaneously. Their engines roared from idle to full throttle in heartbeats. Sound shattered the night. 12 cylinders per engine, 3 engines per boat, 9 total, all screaming at maximum power. The boats lifted their bows out of the water, accelerating toward 40 knots, racing toward the Japanese convoy like hornets emerging from darkness. The ambush had begun, and there was no going back now. The Japanese were caught in that fatal moment between recognition and reaction. Their lookouts saw the wakes first, 3 lines of phosphorescence racing toward them at speeds no submarine or surface ship should achieve. Then they saw the boats themselves, low silhouettes closing the distance at a rate that made calculation impossible. Alarm bells rang across the convoy. Men scrambled to battle stations. Gun crews spun their weapons toward threats they could barely see. Officers shouted orders in Japanese that carried across the water, sharp, urgent sounds that meant the same thing in any language. They were under attack. But recognition came too late. PT-164 was already inside the destroyer screen, racing between the 2 lead escorts at a combined closing speed that gave enemy gunners less than 15 seconds to react. Harrigan opened up with his twin .50 calibers before the Japanese could respond. His thumbs pressed triggers that sent 850 rounds per minute screaming toward the nearest destroyer's bridge. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds found their mark. Tracer fire painted lines of light across darkness. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. Men died at their posts. The destroyer's bridge lights flickered and died. The ship's coordination was disrupted at the critical moment, gun crews suddenly operating without central direction. Patty O'Brien crouched at the torpedo tubes, watching the lead transport grow larger with impossible speed. 800 yards, 600, 500. The transport's hull filled his vision, a wall of steel rising from the water. "Fire one!" Mac's voice cut through the chaos. Patty squeezed the firing trigger. The Mark 13 leaped from its tube with a mechanical thump, splashing into the water, its propeller already spinning at full speed. The gyroscope engaged, holding the torpedo on its programmed course. "Fire two!" The second torpedo followed, twin wakes of phosphorescent bubbles stretching toward the transport, like glowing fingers reaching for a victim. The destroyer to their starboard finally reacted. Its searchlight found them, brilliant white light that turned night into day. Harrigan turned his face away from the glare, firing blind now, his tracers marking where his bullets were going. The .50 calibers roared continuously, barrels heating rapidly, spent brass cascading onto the deck. Then the destroyer's 25mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Green tracers reached out for them like deadly fingers. Shells splashed around them, some so close that spray soaked everyone on deck. One round struck the boat's stern, punching through thin plywood, but by mercy or luck, it didn't hit anything critical. Harrigan felt the boat shudder, heard wood splinter somewhere aft, kept firing because there was nothing else to do. His world had narrowed to thumbs on triggers, targets in the searchlight glare, the mechanical rhythm of guns that might jam but hadn't yet. The first torpedo struck the transport just aft of the bridge with a thunderous explosion that lit up the night like captured lightning. The half-ton warhead detonated against the ship's hull below the waterline, creating a pressure wave that traveled through steel faster than sound, turning metal into shrapnel, compartments into tombs, men into casualties. The transport lurched violently, a visible ripple running through her hull as thousands of tons of ship absorbed energy trying to tear her apart. Water rushed into the breach, flooding compartments, drowning men trapped behind watertight doors that would never open again. 5 seconds later, the second torpedo hit amidships. This one struck near the keel, the worst possible location for any ship to take damage. The explosion broke the transport's back instantly, her spine severed, structural integrity destroyed. The 8,000-ton vessel lifted partially out of the water, driven up by the force of the blast, then came down broken into 2 pieces that began sinking immediately. Through the searchlight glare and gunfire, Harrigan could see hundreds of Japanese soldiers spilling into the water, tiny figures tumbling from listing decks, jumping from railings, trying to escape a ship becoming their tomb. Their screams carried across the water, audible even over engines and guns, sounds of terror and desperation identical in any language. He kept firing, because that was the job, because those soldiers would kill Americans if they survived, because war didn't allow mercy toward enemies, who would show none in return. PT-168 struck next, Bramwell's boat racing in from the port side, his two Mark 13 torpedoes slamming into the second transport almost simultaneously. That ship was loaded with ammunition and fuel destined for Vila's garrison. Tons of explosives stacked in cargo holds, drums of gasoline and diesel lashed to the deck. The first torpedo hit forward, the second hit aft. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the ship exploded like a volcano. The blast was so powerful, it knocked Harrigan off his feet. He hit the deck hard, ears ringing, vision white from the flash. A wave of superheated air washed over PT-164, carrying the smell of burning oil and something worse, something organic that spoke of human bodies caught in the inferno. When Harrigan's vision cleared, the second transport was gone. Not sinking, gone, replaced by a fireball rising hundreds of feet into the air, debris raining down across the entire strait. Flaming wreckage splashed into the water around them, some pieces still burning even as they sank. The explosion illuminated the entire battlefield with flickering orange light. Harrigan could see PT-171 now, Joey Antonelli's boat, racing in from starboard toward the third transport. He could see the Japanese destroyers, their crews stunned by sudden violence, trying to coordinate response to attacks coming from three directions. He could see the surviving transport's crew rushing to battle stations, knowing they were next. But the Japanese destroyers were recovering now, their training and discipline overcoming initial shock. The nearest destroyer turned hard toward PT-164, her captain making a brutal calculation. His main guns couldn't depress low enough to hit the PT boat, but his ship's bow could. He was attempting to ram them, using superior size and mass to simply run them down. At the combined closing speed, they had perhaps 10 seconds before impact. "Hard right rudder, all engines full." Mac threw the wheel over so hard the spokes blurred. Charlie Mendoza opened the throttles past their stops, pushing the Packards beyond redline. PT-164 pivoted, like a dancer. The destroyer's knife bow passed less than 10 feet from their beam, close enough that Harrigan could see individual rivets in the steel hull, could see Japanese sailors on deck staring down at them with expressions of shock and rage. As they passed, Harrigan emptied his remaining ammunition directly into the destroyer at point-blank range. 50 caliber rounds punched through the destroyer's thin side plating, ricocheted through interior compartments, found flesh, and mechanical systems with impartial brutality. He saw sparks fly where bullets struck metal, saw men fall on the destroyer's deck. Then they were past, engines screaming, boat shaking from stress and speed, alive when they should have been dead. PT-171 wasn't as lucky. Antonelli had lined up perfect shots on the third transport, his approach textbook, his crew executing with precision that would have earned praise in training. But a Japanese destroyer caught them with searchlights before they could fire, and suddenly Joey's boat was illuminated like a carnival target, every gun in the convoy swinging towards them. The 25mm cannons found their mark. Shells stitched a line across PT-171's bow, punching through plywood like paper. One round struck a torpedo, but by grace or miracle, the warhead didn't detonate. Another burst caught PT-171's forward gun mount, killing the gunner instantly. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the deck, mixing with blood and seawater. Joey spun the wheel, aborting his attack run, turning away from the convoy. Smoke poured from below decks. His engines coughed, one losing power. PT-171 limped away into darkness, streaming smoke and oil, leaving a trail any Japanese ship could follow. But the enemy ships weren't following. They had their own catastrophe to deal with. The first transport was sinking by the bow, her forward deck already awash. Men still poured from hatches and companionways, abandoning ship, choosing drowning over being trapped in a sinking vessel. The water around the transport was filled with swimming men, their heads visible in reflected firelight, struggling to stay afloat in tropical seas that would exhaust them long before they reached land. The second transport was simply gone, replaced by burning wreckage and an oil slick that would burn for hours. 6,000 Japanese soldiers had been aboard that ship. Perhaps 100 survived the initial explosion, perhaps fewer. Mac brought PT-164 around for another pass. They still had 2 torpedoes remaining, and the third transport was still afloat, still capable of delivering its cargo to Kolombangara. The element of surprise was gone, every searchlight now sweeping the water, guns of every caliber firing in all directions. But the mission wasn't complete. "Stand by to fire remaining fish," Mac called to Patty. The third transport's captain saw them coming. He was good, experienced, a veteran who understood ship handling in ways textbooks couldn't teach. As Patty prepared to fire, the transport turned hard to port, presenting her stern to the approaching torpedoes, combing the wakes, making herself the narrowest possible target. "Fire 3! Fire 4!" The last 2 Mark 13s leaped into the water, but the enemy captain's maneuver was working. The transport was turning parallel to the torpedo tracks, letting them pass along her sides rather than striking her hull. Patty watched in frustration as his carefully maintained weapons ran true and straight, but harmless, missing by yards. The Japanese destroyers were getting their 5-inch guns into action now, and those weapons could blow PT boats to splinters. The first salvo landed short, shell splashes erupting 50 yards ahead. The second salvo would be closer. The third might be perfect. "Get us out of here!" Mac's voice carried the edge of command that meant argument was pointless. They'd already fired everything. PT-164 was out of torpedoes, down to guns and speed, and staying in this killing zone meant dying for no purpose. Mac opened the throttles fully, turning away from the convoy, heading for darkness beyond the searchlights. Behind them, 5-inch shells began landing closer, throwing up columns of water that would crush a wooden boat if they landed close enough. The water around them became a forest of death, shell splashes erupting everywhere, Japanese gun crews walking their fire toward the fleeing PT boat with practiced precision. A shell landed 10 yards to port. The concussion wave lifted the boat partially out of the water, sent men sprawling cracked plywood, in places that would need repair if they survived the next 30 seconds. Another shell landed 5 yards to starboard, so close that shrapnel peppered the hull, punching small holes that would leak but probably wouldn't sink them. Then they were out of the searchlight beams, racing into blessed darkness, shell splashes falling farther behind as Japanese gun crews lost their target. The Packard engines roared at maximum power, pushing them to speeds that made the boat shake like it might come apart, but alive, moving, escaping. Behind them, the battle continued to rage. PT-168, despite taking several hits, had managed to put one more torpedo into the already sinking first transport, ensuring it would never reach Kolombangara. Bramwell's boat was battered but functional, streaming smoke but still making 30 knots. PT-171 was in worse shape. Joey Antonelli managed to keep his boat moving despite multiple hull breaches and one engine completely dead. Water was gaining in the forward compartment. They regrouped 5 miles south of the engagement area, all 3 boats battered but afloat. PT-171 was dying. Water was gaining on the pumps despite every man working bucket brigades. The bow was settling noticeably lower. They came alongside carefully, lashing the boats together despite the risk of collision in rough seas. PT-164's carpenter's mates crossed over with wooden plugs, mattresses, life jackets, anything that could be jammed into holes to slow the flooding. The corpsman transferred to treat PT-171's wounded. 3 men were dead on PT-171, their bodies wrapped in canvas and secured on deck. 2 more were seriously wounded, unconscious from blood loss and shock. 5 others had minor injuries, shrapnel wounds, burns, broken bones. The carpenters' mates worked miracles with limited materials. They plugged the largest holes, shored up bulkheads sagging from water pressure, got the bilge pumps working more efficiently. After an hour of frantic labor, the flooding stabilized. PT-171 wouldn't sink in the next few hours, which was the best outcome they could hope for. The journey back to Rendova took 14 hours, covering what should have been a 3-hour run. They traveled at PT-171's maximum speed of 8 knots, the wounded boat limping along while the other 2 maintained escort positions. Japanese float planes came up at first light, searching for them. They hid in the shadows of small islands, camouflaged with palm fronds hastily cut and draped across the boats, engines off, barely breathing as enemy aircraft droned overhead. Twice they thought they'd been spotted, the search planes circling, coming lower. But the pilots never saw wooden boats hidden among islands and vegetation. The planes moved on, continuing their search pattern, leaving the PT boats sweating in tropical heat beneath their camouflage. By 1400 hours on July 20th, they limped into Rendova harbor. The base crew was waiting, having monitored radio traffic, knowing something major had happened. Medics rushed to PT-171 as soon as the boats touched the dock, carrying off the wounded on stretchers. The 3 dead sailors were carried ashore with honors, covered in American flags, their names already being added to casualty lists that would eventually reach families back home. 3 more deaths to add to the butcher's bill, 3 more families that would receive telegrams, beginning with "regret to inform." But 2 Japanese transports were confirmed sunk. Intelligence would later calculate that nearly 6,000 enemy soldiers had died in those ships, drowned or burned or blown apart, their bodies now resting in Iron Bottom Sound alongside so many others. The 3rd transport, damaged and demoralized, had reversed course and fled back to Rabaul rather than continue to Kolombangara. 8,000 soldiers who were supposed to reinforce Villa would never arrive, never fight, never kill Americans. The mission had succeeded, purchased with blood and luck and wooden boats that shouldn't have survived but somehow did. The debriefing began immediately, even before the wounded had been fully evacuated. Intelligence officers descended on the returning crews like vultures, notebooks open, questions prepared, demanding every detail while memories were fresh and adrenaline hadn't yet faded into exhaustion. They wanted to know everything: Japanese tactics, weapon effectiveness, enemy response times, the exact sequence of events. Each answer would be analyzed, distributed to every PT squadron in the Pacific, turned into lessons that might save American lives in future engagements. Harrigan sat in a folding chair in the operations hut, still wearing clothes stiff with dried salt spray and gunpowder residue, answering questions in a voice that sounded flat and distant even to his own ears. Yes, the 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds were effective against bridge structures. No, the Japanese searchlights didn't have any obvious blind spots. Yes, enemy gun crews responded quickly once they recovered from initial surprise. Paddy O'Brien provided detailed technical information about the torpedoes. 2 hits out of 4 launches, a 50% success rate that was actually excellent by Mark 13 standards. The torpedoes themselves had performed as designed, depth settings accurate, gyroscopes holding course, warheads detonating with full force. Dutch Vanderberg walked the intelligence officers through his calculations, showing how mathematics could predict enemy positions and optimal attack vectors. His firing solutions had been nearly perfect, putting PT-164 exactly where it needed to be at exactly the right time. Mac's debriefing took longest. As mission commander, he had to account for every decision, every maneuver, every tactical choice that had resulted in 2 enemy transports sunk and 1 PT boat barely surviving. He spoke clinically, professionally, describing ramming attempts and shell splashes and torpedo launches, with the same tone he might use to describe a training exercise. By evening, the formal debriefing was complete. The intelligence officers packed up their notebooks and hurried off to compile reports that would reach Pearl Harbor by morning. would be on Admiral Halsey's desk by the next afternoon would influence Pacific strategy for months to come. The crews were left alone finally, released to eat, sleep, or simply sit in stunned silence, processing what they'd survived. Harrigan found himself at the shoreline as the sun set, watching the sky turn the same blood red it had been 24 hours earlier when they'd prepared for the mission. A lifetime ago, an eternity compressed into one night of violence and terror and survival against odds that should have killed them all. He thought about the Japanese soldiers he'd seen spilling into the water, hundreds of men drowning in darkness while he raced past at 40 knots. Enemy soldiers, yes. Men who would have killed Americans, absolutely. But also men who'd had families and dreams and futures that ended in the black waters of Iron Bottom Sound. War didn't allow much room for mercy or doubt, but in quiet moments like this, both found ways to creep in. The radio intercepts began arriving within 48 hours, and they told a story that intelligence analysts found remarkable. Japanese communications were describing the attack in terms that bordered on panic. High-speed torpedo boats appearing from nowhere, multiple ships sunk simultaneously. American secret weapons that moved faster than destroyers and struck like demons from darkness. For the first time since Savo Island, the Imperial Japanese Navy sounded afraid. One intercepted transmission from a destroyer captain to his headquarters at Rabaul described the PT boats as devil craft that materialized from shadow and vanished before we could respond. Another report estimated PT boat speeds at over 50 knots, faster than they actually were, suggesting that panic had inflated the threat in Japanese minds. A third transmission recommended that all future convoys include triple the normal destroyer escort, specifically to counter the American mosquito boat threat. That last point was crucial. Every destroyer assigned to convoy escort duty was a destroyer that couldn't hunt submarines, couldn't screen carrier task forces, couldn't support amphibious operations. The PT boats were forcing the Japanese to divert resources far out of proportion to the actual threat, creating strategic advantages that extended far beyond ships sunk. The psychological impact rippled through the Japanese fleet. Sailors who'd once owned the night, who'd moved with confidence through waters they controlled, now had to assume that every shadow might hide American attackers. They couldn't distinguish between actual threats and phantoms, couldn't know if PT boats were lurking or if they were jumping at ghosts. That fear, that uncertainty, was worth more than any number of ships sunk, but the cost of creating that fear continued to mount in ways that would haunt the survivors. 2 weeks after the successful Blackett Strait engagement, PT 166 hit a mine while returning from patrol. The explosion broke the boat's back, and she sank in less than 30 seconds. All 12 hands were lost. PT 162 was caught by Japanese destroyers in daylight when engine failure left her dead in the water. The enemy ship shot the disabled PT boat to pieces from safe range. Only 3 men survived. Joey Antonelli survived torpedoes, shells, and near sinking that night in Blackett Strait. 3 weeks later, a sniper's bullet from an island he'd never heard of killed him instantly while his boat refueled at a forward base. War's arithmetic was cruel and random. By October 1943, when Harrigan was rotated back to the States for new construction training, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9 had lost 7 boats and 73 men. But in exchange, they'd sunk or damaged over 40 Japanese vessels and killed thousands of enemy soldiers who never reached their destinations. The mathematics were brutal, but undeniable. Every PT boat lost was replaceable. Boatyards in America could build new ones in weeks. Every crew member killed could be replaced by new volunteers. But Japanese ships and experienced crews were irreplaceable. Japan's industrial capacity was shrinking under American pressure, their pool of skilled sailors depleting with every battle. The exchange rate favored America, even when the cost was measured in young lives cut short. The secret weapon had proven itself. 3 wooden boats had shattered Japanese confidence and changed the balance of power in the Pacific. But the real story, the psychological warfare, the desperate innovations, and the price paid by those who survived, that story was only beginning. In Part 2, we'll reveal what happened to these men after the battle, how Japan's Navy tried and failed to counter the PT boat threat, and the legacy that still influences naval warfare today. If you want to know how this secret weapon changed World War II forever, Part 2 is already available. The link is in the description. And if this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these forgotten heroes.